The story begins with a quiet shock that arrives not through legend or inherited memory, but through a modern test, a result that suggests Norwegian ancestry where Gaelic continuity was once assumed. The implication is not merely genetic. It unsettles a narrative long held in the Western Isles of Scotland, a narrative in which the Gaels are cast as settled communities disrupted by sudden northern violence. If ancestry traces back to Scandinavia in such large measure, the roles of victim and aggressor begin to blur, not as accusation, but as historical tension. What seems stable becomes uncertain. Identity, once anchored in language and landscape, reveals deeper layers shaped by movement, contact, and power. This uncertainty leads us to Islay, a windswept island off the west coast where belonging is measured not by arrival but by generations. Here, the term islander is not symbolic. It is earned through continuity. Everyone else remains an incomer, no matter how long they stay. The land reinforces this mindset. Low hills open to the Atlantic. Long sea locks cut deep into the interior. A place that feels both exposed and self-contained. Pride here is not abstract. It is rooted in soil, weather, and memory. For centuries, the prevailing assumption held that outside forces passed through briefly, that the Vikings came, struck, and moved on. Yet the island itself resists that simplicity. Geography does not suggest a place easily abandoned. It suggests a place worth holding. What we are left with is not a reversal of history, but a reframing. A recognition that ancestry, like coastline, is shaped by erosion and overlap rather than clean breaks. To understand why Islay mattered, one must first consider movement rather than motive. During the early medieval period, Scandinavian expansion was not random violence but directional pressure. To the east lay rival powers. To the south, established kingdoms. Westward offered fragmented coastlines, lightly defended islands, and maritime access unmatched anywhere else in Europe. Viking ships were not just vessels of war. They were instruments of reach, able to enter shallow waters, cross open sea, and withdraw with speed. Against this technology, isolation became vulnerability. Islay sat directly in the path of this expansion. Positioned between Ireland and mainland Scotland, it occupied a strategic middle ground within the old Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada. Control of Islay meant influence over sea routes that connected the Hebrides to Ulster and beyond. The island's two major sea locks nearly divided in half, creating natural corridors inland. For a longship, these were not obstacles but invitations. A small force could penetrate deeply, isolating communities before resistance could organize. The people who lived here at the time were not warriors by trade. They were farmers, fishers, families tied to seasonal rhythms and local knowledge. In such encounters, disparity mattered more than numbers. Better weapons, coordinated crews, and a readiness for violence altered outcomes quickly. It is reasonable to infer that early contact was brutal, not because of cultural cruelty, but because conquest in that era left little room for coexistence at first contact. Survival often meant submission, displacement, or absorption. What followed was not silence, but transformation. The question often asked is whether the Vikings eventually left. Evidence suggests they did not. What changed instead was the surface appearance of culture. Over time, Norse settlers did not remain separate. They adapted, intermarried, and gradually adopted the language and customs already rooted in the land. This process was not sudden. It unfolded across generations. Norse speech faded. Gaelic reasserted itself, not through eradication, but through adoption. The people remained. The language shifted. For many years, historians assumed that Viking influence weakened as it moved south, that northern Scotland bore the brunt, while places like Islay experienced only brief occupation. Linguistic patterns now challenge that view. Place names across the island preserve Old Norse origins, not clustered in one region, but spread across farms, hills, rivers, and coastal features. These names survived because names are practical. They anchor memory to landscape. Once spoken and passed on, they resist erasure even when the language around them changes. A name does not require literacy to endure. It requires repetition. Parents teach children. Neighbors correct pronunciation. Over centuries, sounds shift slightly, but meaning persists. The endurance of Norse place names across Islay suggests long-term settlement rather than temporary raids. It implies families who stayed, worked the land, and understood it well enough to name it. Conquest alone cannot explain that depth of integration. Something more gradual was at work, a blending that left no clear line where one people ended and another began. Genetic evidence adds another layer to this picture, not as a verdict but as context. Modern islanders who trace their families back hundreds of years sometimes discover that a majority of their ancestry points to Norway. This does not negate their Gaelic identity. It complicates it. Language and blood do not always move together. Cultural inheritance can persist even as genetic origins diversify. In Islay, Gaelic survived not because Norse settlers vanished, but because many of them chose to live within an existing cultural framework. This challenges a common assumption that cultural survival requires biological dominance. Here, the opposite appears true. Norse settlers became part of a Gaelic-speaking world. They married into local families. They raised children who spoke the language of the island. Over time, Norse identity softened into something local, something shaped by climate, labor, and shared experience. What remained Scandinavian was not speech but ancestry, quietly carried forward. Such processes are rarely documented in detail. They leave few dramatic records. Instead, they leave patterns, names on maps, DNA in descendants, farming boundaries that align with older divisions. These are indirect traces, but they align with physical reality. Empires in the early medieval world were built not only through force, but through settlement. Stability required roots. On Islay, those roots grew deep enough to outlast the language that first named them. The legacy of the Vikings on Islay is therefore not one of disappearance, but of continuity through change. The image of raiders who came and left does not hold here. The settlers who arrived in the 9th century remained, shaping the island's population across centuries. They were neither uniquely savage nor uniquely benevolent. They acted, as many groups did, in a fragmented world where land, food, and access determined survival. What distinguishes Islay is not the violence of its past, but the quiet endurance that followed. Today, islanders do not carry resentment toward those distant conquerors. Time has softened conflict into heritage. What matters is not who arrived first, but who stayed, adapted, and passed something forward. The island stands as a reminder that history is not preserved only in chronicles or monuments. It lives in fields still worked, in names still spoken, and in families who remain where their ancestors settled. As this story draws to a close, it invites reflection rather than judgment. If this account resonates, you can mark that by liking the film, not as approval but as acknowledgement. Subscribing becomes a way of staying connected to stories shaped by evidence and memory. And if you choose to comment, consider sharing a family story tied to settlement, migration, labor, or survival. These fragments of lived history, carried across generations, are how the past continues to speak. What makes Islay especially revealing is not a single event, but the accumulation of small, consistent signals across the landscape. Fields align with older divisions. Routes between farms follow paths that make sense only if used repeatedly over long periods. These patterns suggest continuity of use rather than interruption. A raiding force passes through. A settled community reorganizes space. The difference is visible not in drama, but in persistence. On Islay, the land itself records that persistence quietly. The Norse presence did not erase what came before. Instead, it layered itself onto an existing world. Farming practices adjusted to local conditions. Fishing grounds were shared and redefined. Seasonal rhythms remained familiar even as new techniques and tools appeared. Over time, distinctions blurred. A Norse descendant plowing a field inherited from a Gaelic family was no longer acting as an outsider. Daily labor dissolves sharp identities faster than ideology ever could. This gradual blending challenges the way conquest is often imagined. It was not a single turning point, but a prolonged negotiation with reality. Weather imposed limits, distance constrained authority. The island demanded cooperation more than domination. Those who adapted endured. Those who did not were absorbed or forgotten. History here is not marked by clear victory or defeat, but by accommodation shaped by necessity. Language offers one of the clearest windows into this process because it reflects both power and intimacy. While Old Norse faded as a spoken language on Ile, it did not vanish abruptly. It lingered in sounds, in place names, in the cadence of speech long after its grammar was gone. Gaelic became dominant again, but it carried these embedded remnants forward, reshaped yet recognizable to those who know how to listen. This does not imply resistance or loss. Languages change because people choose what is useful, expressive, and shared. On Islay, Gaelic provided continuity with surrounding regions and with earlier traditions. Norse settlers adopted it not under coercion, but because it worked within their new social reality. Their children grew up bilingual at first, then primarily Gaelic-speaking, while still inheriting Scandinavian ancestry and memory. Such transitions rarely leave explicit testimony. No one records the moment a household switches languages. It happens quietly, generation by generation. The result is a surface impression of cultural stability that masks deeper complexity beneath. When modern islanders speak Gaelic today, they are not reenacting an untouched past. They are participating in a living outcome shaped by centuries of interaction and choice. The Viking Age itself sits at the edge of historical clarity. Written records are sparse and often external. Archaeology fills some gaps, but much remains inferred rather than observed directly. This uncertainty has sometimes encouraged myth, either romantic or condemnatory. Ile resists both. Its evidence points neither to total destruction nor to peaceful coexistence from the start. It suggests phases, each shaped by shifting balance and circumstance. Early violence was likely real and devastating for some communities. Over time, survival favored those who adapted to new power structures. Later generations inherited a world already blended. By then, identity was less about origin and more about belonging. The island did not preserve purity, it preserved continuity. That distinction matters. Understanding this helps recalibrate how we view the Vikings more broadly. They were not an exception in a violent age, nor were they uniquely transformative by intent. Their lasting impact came from settlement and integration rather than conquest alone. On Islay, what endured was not Norse rule but Norse presence, absorbed into something that continued to evolve long after political control faded. For modern audiences, especially those distant from this landscape, the lesson is not about assigning credit or blame. It is about recognizing how history actually moves. Grand narratives simplify. Local histories complicate. On Islay, identity did not survive by resisting change but by incorporating it. The island's people did not preserve themselves by exclusion. They did so by adaptation, by turning strangers into kin over time. This perspective reframes ancestry tests and genetic discoveries. Numbers alone do not define identity. They illuminate pathways. A predominantly Scandinavian genetic profile does not negate a Gaelic cultural inheritance. It explains how that inheritance came to be carried by people whose origins were once elsewhere. The past here is not a closed chapter. It is a process still visible in families who remain on the land. Such understanding requires patience. It asks us to accept ambiguity rather than certainty. The island offers no single answer to who belonged and who did not. Instead, it shows how belonging itself was constructed slowly, through shared labor, shared risk, and shared memory. That construction is what endured. As the film concludes, Islay stands not as a symbol of conquest, but as a record of survival through change. Its hills and shorelines do not speak of purity. They speak of continuity shaped by movement, pressure, and choice. The Vikings who arrived did not disappear. and neither did those who came before them. What remains is a community formed by centuries of overlap, where ancestry and culture followed different paths yet arrived at the same present. If this account has held your attention, marking it with a like becomes a quiet acknowledgement that such histories matter. Subscribing is a way to remain connected to stories that value evidence and restraint over spectacle. And if you choose to comment, consider sharing a family memory tied to settlement, migration, work, or adaptation across generations. These lived connections, carried forward and spoken aloud, are how history continues beyond the screen.